Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar in which we're going to talk about how to pass the audit check for your double materiality assessment. And thanks for your patience. We started a minute late because the fire alarm was going off here in the office, and would not be nice to start with panic, right? Because we want to put people at ease in guiding them through the double materiality assessment. So welcome, everyone. My name is Jens. I'm one of the co-founders of Karomia. And here we'd like to take 30 minutes of your time to guide you through on how to pass the audit check for your DMA. So before we dive in, maybe it's good to take a closer look at what this audit check is all about. So first of all, it's important to mention that that on your CSRD report, which will include your double materiality assessment, that you will need to get the limited assurance from your statutory auditor. So what is this limited assurance? Well, it's actually different from the level of assurance that you'll need on your financial statements. It is an assurance level where basically your auditor will look at the process that you followed, will basically look if there's any major deviations from what is typically the process. And so the auditor itself will not go in and look at every nitty-gritty detail, will not be in a mode of retesting and recalculating elements. So in the end, the outcome will be nothing has come to our attention, or we're not aware of any major deviations from how it should be done. So it is important to keep this in mind. So they will not really zoom in the nitty-gritty details. And what is also important is that there are no specific rules for auditors on how to evaluate and look at your double materiality assessment. Basically, we're all looking at the same inputs, and we're all looking at the same Bible, so to speak, which is what you see on the right-hand side. And so that's the recommendations, the guidelines from EFRAG. So do not think that there is like a magical checklist out there. We're all looking at the same document. So now let's have a closer look at the double materiality assessment on its own, because when you look at those guidelines from EFRAG, they are quite open to interpretation. And if you're going through this process for the very first time, it's often quite daunting. And there's many questions that are popping up. Like, what are my IROs? Like, how do I need to do this? I've never done this. It's so artificial. But then stakeholders, like, who is that for me? Is that people within my organization, outside of my organization? Data collection. How do I go about this? I've talked to my people last week in surveys. I have regular talks with my customers, like, do I then need to do this all over again? How do you set thresholds? Because IFRA is quite vague on that as well. Like, you need to figure out your own interpretation. And then reporting, like, what do I report? Right? So there's many different elements that are still out in the open, are vague, where you will need to take decisions, and those decisions obviously will be looked at by the auditor, and that's where you don't want to fail. It's like a bad word, but where you don't want to, let's say, raise any red flags. And so the goal of this webinar is for you to share some tips and tricks based on our experience. Because we've been through several audits already with our customers, and you see the auditors that looked at us and looked at our client engagements, and we've had 100% success rate. So this, I mean, it's not to brag, but it's really to share some of those insights that we gained from those assessments, and to also help you with your double materiality assessment on getting a successful pass with these auditors as well. So we looked at the process of a double materiality assessment with the IRO, stakeholders, data collection, thresholds, and reports. What is important is, or let's say a tip that I can give, is to actually look at this in the form of a funnel. It is actually a process where you go through, and in the end of the process, it is you expect to see a list of material topics, basically that that will define the scope of your CSRD report. And that funnel typically has, in our view, 3 different phases. You start with a long list, you go to short list, and then in the end, you will know what is material and what's not material for your business. But what are we talking about in this funnel? We are actually pushing through IROs. IROs, you may have heard before, so if you've read a bit of EFRAG and if you started, then IROs, you'll know that it stands for impacts, risks, and opportunities. And so what you'll do at the beginning of the funnel is you're gonna feed in as many IROs as you can possibly imagine. So at the beginning of the funnel, it's important to be exhaustive, to not exclude anything, to just be exhaustive and identifying and pushing IROs through your funnel. When you go to the next step, in the direction of the shortlist, there you will take some of those IROs and you'll assess them with your stakeholders. So you will ask the feedback from your affected stakeholders and to then actually define which ones are material and which ones are not. In this part of the funnel, it's important to be correct. There are specific rules and there are specific ways to collect this information, and there is important to be following the guidelines. Now, at the end of the funnel, you need to be transparent. There, it's important to be quite articulate on which of the IROs are material and which ones are not, because this is in the end what will drive the scope of your CSRD report. So it's really a funnel where you have a lot of quantity in the beginning. You take some of those in the middle where you will assess them, and in the end, some will truly stick, meaning some will be material and others will not be material. And that's kind of the process that you need to follow. What is very, very important, and this is a tip that I can give because not everyone is doing this, but it's something I would highly recommend for you to do as well, is that when you are feeding IROs into this process, into this funnel, make sure that you link from the start every IRO with the ESRS topics. And it may seem a bit absurd, you don't really see the value of it, but I would truly recommend to do this. Why? Because the relationship between the IRO and the ESRS topics will be established from the beginning, and it will allow you to be exhaustive in the identification of the IROs, because you might actually, if you start just out of the blue identifying IROs, there might be big blind spots. You might not be thinking of your business in the context of affected communities or in terms of biodiversity. And that's something that you want to avoid. So matching those IROs directly from the beginning with ESRS topics will truly help you as well, because in the end, it's the IROs representing those ESRS topics that will then define the scope of your CSRD report. So something I can highly recommend to do from the beginning. And this is also something that is very much appreciated by the auditor if this is incorporated throughout the funnel process. Now, looking at this funnel, there are a couple of basics that we would advise you to respect, because these are the elements that the auditor will also, more often than not, really zoom in on. And when we're looking at the long list phase, and so at the beginning of the funnel, there's a couple of things that are very important. First off is that you need to consider your entire value chain. So do not think about your own activities, but make sure to also identify the IROs that are happening up and downstream, and not just one level up and one level down, but make sure that you look at your entire value chain and that you are complete and exhaustive in that, that you're not just looking at suppliers, but that you can also think about suppliers of suppliers and customers of customers. Because we've seen, I mean, not all of the auditors, they're all the same, we've seen auditors that are very strict on this. So make sure that you are exhaustive and you're not ignoring the fact that some materials, some raw materials can really come from areas where there are issues, for example, with affected communities or where there's huge impacts on biodiversity. So don't try to ignore, make sure that you address them and that you're transparent on this. What's also very important is to apply little judgment and to not think, animal welfare and my business, for example, is not material and therefore I'm not going to include it. Well, it's better to let's say to be exhaustive and to have it in there, because if your auditor will then look at, okay, but then what was the long list that you started off with, and he or she cannot find those elements that are typically available, that were assessed, for example, with a competitor or with another player in your industry, then it will raise some red flags. So you're not in the business of hiding anything. Just be exhaustive and don't apply too much judgment. A tip that we can give as well is to go to the subtopic level. So before I mentioned that every IRO is matched to an ESRS topic. Well, actually, we advise you to go to the subtopic level. That has some key benefits. It allows you to be more granular, but it's still manageable because there are not as many subtopics as there are subtopics. But going to the subtopic level will allow you to descope part of your CSRD reporting efforts. So you might be in a situation where G1, governance, business conduct, is material for your business. Then you'll be required to report on G1. But there are many different elements, subtopics, part of G1, animal welfare being one of them, that might not be relevant at all for your business. But then if you've assessed animal welfare as a subtopic in your double materiality assessment, you'll have the arguments, you'll have the ammunition to say, well, I'm not going to report on it. Why? Because I included it in my double materiality assessment and I can rule it out because it was not material. So go to that subtopic level. It will make sure that you're more exhaustive and it will bring opportunities down the road for you when it comes to the scope of your CSRD report. That's also how we do it with our clients. We actually take the ESRS topics as the starting point, and per ESRS topic and subtopic, we will categorize and make sure that we identify all of the potential and actual impacts, positive, negative risks and opportunities. So we actually take it from that framework to identify within those topics and subtopics what are the impacts, risks, and opportunities. So if you have the time and if you have, let's say, the resources to this, I would very much recommend you to follow the same structure. So what are the basics in the shortlisting phase? So that's the phase in which you will engage with all of your affected stakeholders. So who are your affected stakeholders and how to engage with them? Well, it is an entire topic on its own. I'm not going to zoom in too much on this today because we're actually organizing a webinar on this particular topic in a few weeks. So at the end, you'll, I would say, mark your dates on this one. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but do make sure that you are also following the basics when it comes to engaging with your affected stakeholders. Now, here, the tips that I can give already is, as you mentioned before, the subtopics, they're quite important, or they can be very helpful in your assessment here as well. So make sure that in your data collection exercise that you are including those subtopics. So again, the example of animal welfare, it does not mean that because you're picking up animal welfare as part of your double materiality assessment, that you need to have every customer, every supplier, every employee respond to the question of animal welfare. Can be 1, 2, 3 people inputs that talk about animal welfare. We're gonna collect some feedback, and then normally feedback will be overwhelmingly like not material for us. Great, you've included in the assessment, there is data to prove that you've asked your stakeholders, and then you can move on. And so try to really use the double materiality assessment process to your advantage, and do not try to fight the process in that sense. The scoring itself of the IROs and the questions that come with it, if you read the IFRAC guidelines, and you know it's quite a complex beast, where they talk about scope, scale, remediability, etc. I mean, you probably had to read it twice, 3 times, 4 times to truly understand what they mean with that, right? It is not very intuitive. Well, it's the same for your stakeholders. So, so what we would recommend, and this is also very much appreciated by the auditor, is that you are also pragmatic in this, right? So what we do is that we ask only experts or people who have knowledge about a certain topic to go to the subscore level as defined by IFRAC. In all other cases, we ask people to respond on a more general severity score. But the fact that we are pragmatic and that we allow, let's say, for people that have less expertise to still give their opinion, but then for the experts to like dig deeper and zoom in, is something that is very, very much appreciated. So do not try to, let's say, take too many shortcuts and just focus on just one score, but don't also go on the other extreme and have people answer all of the sub scores, because they will not be able to. So find that good balance in the middle, and that will be the best for your assessment as well. So at the end of the process, what are the different elements to consider there? Well, here you're in the phase of defining what's material and what's not. And so here you will basically bring all of it together, and you will also document how you've come to certain conclusions. So here the methodology that you followed is quite important. And that's basically your interpretation of those IFRAC guidelines. And that's mainly what the auditor will look at. So how did you basically decide which topics are material, which ones are not? So the way that you've done the IRO analysis there is very important. Here, let me zoom in on a few of those challenges and tips that I can give. Because you're going to be talking to a lot of different stakeholders. What we see is that you don't value every stakeholder necessarily as much as the other. So what we then advise is to apply weights. You can have weights on different levels, but and we apply them on different dimensions. So individual expertise, data collection methods, etc. But I imagine that for some that gets quite complex. So if you want to apply one weight dimension, I would suggest to focus on a weight for a stakeholder group across certain ESRS topics. And remember, all of your IROs, they are attached to ESRS subtopic, therefore topic. So therefore, you can really match, and you can really say like, my employees, for example, I truly value their input on S1. Or when it comes to suppliers, for example, they really have a lot to say about S2, workers in the value chain, because that talks directly about them. So that's a distinction that you then can make when you bring all of the different scores together. And then what we typically see is that the objective desk research, for example, so where there's a lot more science available in order to measure impacts, risks, and opportunities, that is often valued quite a bit compared to, for example, input from customers or suppliers, people who are a bit further away, have less knowledge about certain domains. And so that's balance that you can bring to your assessments. That's absolutely okay, and it's even recommended to do so. Another element that is often a topic or a debate is how do you then at the end set thresholds? Because IFRA is quite open, flexible, vague on how to set them. Well, here we would recommend to be quite robust in the approach, but for us it also means being pragmatic. So how do we set thresholds? And you're free to copy our approach. I'll actually be happy if it helps you. But how we do it is first we define what we consider the absolute threshold. And the absolute threshold for us is the average of all the ESRS topic scores. And so if you get the scores aggregated to a topic level, and the average of all those scores is what we consider the absolute thresholds. And that's basically what you can see here. So it's indicated in blue. And so we calculate this for both on the impact side and on the financial side. Everything above is by default material. We're not even considering or reconsidering this. So this is material. But then everything which lies in that purple zone, which is what we call potentially material, those are the topics that are, let's say, close to the border, which are, well, maybe if it was interpreted a bit different, it might be material, but could also be that it is validly not material. So there, what we advise is to apply sound judgment, to really look at the data that was collected, look at the comments that people have left, like how did they interpret the question? Did they interpret the question in a correct way? Is there a general level of consensus within a stakeholder group? But compared to other stakeholder groups, like how much are people aligned on this? And that will give you a sense of maybe there's some people clearly underestimating or not very knowledgeable about a certain topic, but then others really are. So that will give you inputs and hints on making a sound decision. Is this a material topic or not for my business? And then everything which is below 3, we consider not to be material. So applying this logic of absolute thresholds, potentially material topics, is helping us really on getting a pragmatic outcome on the material topics for a business. And then there's a last tip that I can give, and it may sound or it may look obvious, but in the process of your double materiality assessment, when you are going from the long list phase to the short list phase, we would highly recommend to do an auditor check-in. And in this auditor check-in, what you'll do is you'll take a closer look at the long list of the IROs, how you've established them, how you've come to the vast majority of those, and then how you're planning on engaging your stakeholders. Like, who are you planning to engage? How are you planning to engage? And basically sharing that with your auditor. Typically, it's a 1-hour meeting. They'll ask a few questions, right? But as such, they are part of the process. And if they have any concerns, if they spot any red flags, they can already raise them. And you can anticipate and you can work on them so that if there is something which is clearly very important to the auditor that you may have not been aware, you can still incorporate it. And you're not stuck on an outcome or on a process where in the end they might, let's say, fail you. So as such, you've really pulled them into the process and you've basically acquired their buy-in for a good end result as well. So voilà. That's basically the end of this very short webinar, in which I wanted to share a few highlights on how to pass the audit check. So to summarize, what are the key tips? And so first off, think of it as a funnel. Very important to keep that in mind. Second is that within your funnel, the IROs that you include, make sure they are linked to the ESRS topics and subtopics. Highly recommend to go to the subtopic level, and then make sure to respect some of the basics in that flow, because those are the elements that the auditor will pay close attention to. Now, in terms of next steps, you can actually, if you want to learn more and see how we could potentially support, there's a sandbox available where you can actually try out our platform for your double materiality assessments, free to try it out. And then there's going to be a next webinar, like I mentioned before, on August 20th, where we're going to zoom in on the best practices on how to engage with your stakeholders. So that will be online very soon. So stay tuned for that. Now, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So let me see if there's anything popping up. And if not, then must have been super, super clear. And I'm also very happy with that. Don't see anything popping up, so that's great. Voilà, there's the question, sorry. Are you allowed to do the first DMA with a well-defined limited scope, meaning, for instance, only tier 1 supply chain or limited? Oh, and now the question disappears. Wait, now will I get the question back? Or limited stakeholders. Of course, it will be more refined in future iterations. So I think this is indeed a very valid point that sometimes going full blown into your value chain and assessing your topics with every potential partner can be quite a strain as well. So the way that we look at this is definitely fine to, let's say, have a certain focus. We've actually seen clients of us doing it as well, saying, well, this year I'm going to be quite limited on engaging with my customers, with my suppliers, because last year I've questioned them on the SDGs, for example, or I've just done a big market research and I don't want to bother them again. That's totally fine. But then what they'll do is they'll have this as a comment, as a to-do, which then also validate with the auditor and say, well, you know, next year or in 18 months from now, we'll then really take the time on re-engaging with them, and we're going to go a bit further, a bit deeper, and collecting input from more stakeholders in order to keep on growing and keep on fine-tuning the outcome of the results. So that's definitely fine, that level of pragmatism. We've seen other clients do that, and the auditors are typically very much okay with that as well, because no one is getting this perfect from the first time. How does the scoring for both financial and impact come in the graph? Well, so what you'll do in the data collection phase is you're going to collect scores on those questions that represent the IROs. So you're going to ask people to give a score from 1 to 5, and those scores, those IROs are representing an ESRS subtopic and a topic, right? So when you're calculating those scores that you present in a graph, typically you'll present the scores on the ESRS topic level. So it means that you have your IROs where you have scores, then you'll have the subtopics, and then you'll need to bring it up to the higher level. So there's a lot of scores to aggregate, and within that calculation you're probably going to apply weights as well, and that's going to complexify a bit the exercise. So there's quite some data aggregation to be done, but that's basically how you define those final scores, and to then calculate what the ESRS scores are, what the scores are for those ESRS topics. So I hope that answered your question. That was clear. All right, this is 12:30. We're already at the end of the session. So if there's any more questions, do not hesitate to reach out. Happy to help you with your double materiality assessment. Even if you're not using our platform, if I can help, I'm a happy man. So thanks a lot for joining. I would say enjoy your lunch and catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.